All right, welcome to another edition of WaveLab Workflows. My name is Justin Perkins. Today I'm going to show you what is new in WaveLab 11. As you may know, WaveLab 11 was released last week. And for those who haven't tried it yet, there will be a trial available, I would say near the end of the month, perhaps early October. Traditionally, Steinberg likes to wait a few weeks to offer a trial version. So for those waiting for the trial, it's going to be just a few weeks. But for those of you that have upgraded or thinking of upgrading today, I'm going to show you some of my favorite new things in WaveLab 11. And yeah, so if there's any issues with the sound, please let me know. I did some testing, should be all good, but I appreciate any heads up. And yeah, so I'm going to give you some of my favorite new features of WaveLab 11. And another mastering engineer named Ian Stewart has done a bunch of great videos that show the new features as well. In particular, the multi-channel editing for surround sound and multi-channel formats. I'm going to be honest that I don't really work with that at all, so I'm not going to really dive into the multi-channel stuff today because I don't really have the setup or the experience or the real-life experience to show you. So we're going to not sure too much of that today, but I'm going to show you a bunch of other cool stuff. A lot of new plugins. There's more plugin processing slots. Some new features for stem mastering, and even if not stem mastering, even some of these features are really useful for normal mastering as well. So I'm just checking out a question here. All right, so let's just dive in. First of all, there's a new start menu. So what I'm going to do is actually quit WaveLab. And if your settings do not show you the start menu, you can hold Command on Mac. And this is kind of a new start or welcome menu. Just a little bit, I think it shows you more stuff. I personally like to start with an empty project every time, but for those that like to have a menu, you can see all the recent projects, whether it's a montage or a file, projects. You can search, you can filter, all these types of things, and you can sell your templates. So this is just a new, I think, cleaner, smarter menu system. I'm checking out a question from Katie. Yeah, it's a great question. That was the first thing I was going to cover is presets and preferences. When you install WaveLab 11, any earlier versions of WaveLab that you have stay fully intact. There's no they have their own preferences folder. So the first time after you install WaveLab 11 and the first time you launch it, it's going to ask if you want to import your WaveLab 10 preferences, or if you're on WaveLab 9.5, it'll ask if you want to import those preferences to your WaveLab 11 folder, and you can choose yes or no. If you want everything to carry over so it basically looks the same as you're used to, you can choose yes. And if you want to start clean, choose no. On my WaveLab help website, I've gone over this, but the preferences folder is something that you can find, and I like to save it in my favorites bar on the left side so I can get at it. But as you can see, here's my WaveLab Pro 10 preferences folder, and here's 11. They're totally separate, so there's no risk of losing any settings from 10, and there's no risk of not being able to open up 10. They're totally separate applications. In fact, if you go to my applications folder, you can see 10 and 11 right there. So, and you'll notice 11 has the new green icon, which I like. And yeah, so let's get into it. Like I said, I like to use this default setting of an empty space. Now, if you don't know where your preferences folder is, once you have WaveLab open, you can go to WaveLab Preferences, Global, and you can choose this Open Setting Folder option. And that's going to reveal on your Mac where this folder is. Now I use a different thing called Pathfinder. It's like a third-party finder. But basically, when you choose Open Setting Folder, it's going to reveal right in your Finder where that folder is, and then you can drag it over to your favorites to kind of keep track of it because it's somewhat hidden in your library. So if you need to manually play with any preferences, and you can transfer over just certain preferences, like just your render settings or something like that, if you want to, or just your CD Wizard settings. They're all in here. And if you go to wavelabhelp.com, the very first video, which is actually on the bottom, it's me explaining how to find that preferences folder and copy and paste stuff. So That's all I'll say about that. Is it's a totally separate app, separate preferences, but you can migrate your settings if you like to. So one of my favorite new features of WaveLab is just the multi-core processing. So this should be set by default, but if you go to, again, preferences, audio montages, hopefully this setting here is chosen with process with multiple cores. This should speed up rendering time, and overall I've noticed a better experience with playback with heavy CPU sessions. This summer I was mastering a very intense live album. It was very long, and due to some of the edits, it was starting to cause some playback problems, and it was getting hard to hear what was going on in WaveLab 10. And when I switched over to 11, all those problems went away. The playback was smoother, there was no interruptions, and I could work so much better. So that was a great example just to see the difference in performance, both in playback and rendering time. So multi-core processing, it really helps, for rendering in the montage specifically. So I've had people ask, if the features are worth upgrading to 11, and I think just the performance improvement alone, if you use WaveLab every day and you care about rendering times, and if rendering times help you get the job done faster and get done faster, then that's worth it alone. I think you'll notice a nice improvement. And there is another graphics improvement coming in the very first maintenance update in a few weeks for Mac users that makes the graphics in the montage even a little faster, but already it's a great improvement. There's more plugin slots. So let me open up a montage. I'll open up a new one. And for those new to WaveLab, this is the default layout of WaveLab. This might be what it looks like when you first open it. You have the master section, which is a master section for the entire program, meaning whatever file you're playing is going to come out of that, go through this section. And then the inspector has your clip, track, and output effects. I've gone over that a few times, but this is the default layout. You can customize WaveLab very heavily to how you like it, and I'm just going to choose my preferred layout here because this puts the inspector back up here. And the reason I like it up there is because that's where it kind of used to be in earlier versions. And as you can see, I have the master section hidden and floating, so I can just hide it. To me, that gets more screen real estate. So I'm just checking out a few questions here. All right, so yeah, this view gives me more screen real estate. This is how I prefer to look at WaveLab. But what I was going to say is, for those that are new to WaveLab, there's a lot of places that you can insert plugins when you're mastering an album or an EP or a single in the audio montage. So I'm just going to open up any old song here. So in the montage, you have clip effects, of course. So clip effects are plugins that you apply right on each song, right on each piece of audio. Track effects are plugins that you insert right on the audio track itself, right here. And the montage output is kind of like the master output of the entire audio montage, which is basically your project or your session in WaveLab. So all of those areas have plugin slots. And in WaveLab 11, you have 16 plugin slots. So you can insert 16 plugins on a clip, 16 more on a track, 16 more on the montage output. So that's a lot of plugins. I think if you're running out of plugins slots, maybe you can think about simplifying some things. So there's quite a lot of plugin slots. And then there's the whole entire master section, which I've mentioned. I prefer to not use the master section for processing because it doesn't automatically save and load with each project, which is a little confusing. I like everything to be within the montage. But what I do use the master section for is playback processing. And for those that aren't aware, playback processing is plugins that are running live on playback, but they're not able to be part of your rendered audio. So this is a good place to put additional metering. It's a good place to put something like SonarWorks or room correction software or headphone correction software. And again, the reason it's good for that kind of thing is there's no danger of you rendering your master through this, correction software, or even though metering shouldn't produce any artifacts, I like to be safe and see I have the TC Clarity M, which is a hardware meter, but the plugin that feeds the audio, it's in the playback processing. And this has been expanded from 3 to 5 slots in WaveLab Pro 11. And I think that's a good thing, especially as people are maybe having to work from home a little more in the last year and a half. I think 3 slots was a little tight, so now you should have plenty of space for any metering that you like that isn't part of WaveLab, and any correction software, any other odds and ends, some A/B plugins, those types of things. And, of course, WaveLab has the encoder checker for checking different lossy codecs, things like that. So there's a lot more plugin slots in WaveLab 11. So some people might find that attractive. And yeah, so, and on the topic of plugins, there's a number of new plugins in WaveLab 11 from Steinberg that I'm going to get into. But one of my favorite new features of WaveLab 11 is that you can save a default starting point for each plugin. Now, I know a lot of plugins have this by default, but there's some plugins that do not. So, you know, one of my favorite EQ plugins, it does have a default starting point built in the plugin itself, so that's nice. But here's a plugin that I like. Let me see, try to find it. Whoa, that's a lot of plugins. The Vertigo VSM3. This is a cool plugin for mastering. The default starting points are terrible for mastering. It sounds like it's run through a bass fuzz pedal. So once you find a good starting point for this particular plugin, when you insert it, you can go to Save As, and you can go to Default Preset. You can save as default preset. So that means whenever this plugin is loaded, it's going to be to your preferred starting point. Now that can be totally clean, like an EQ, you might want to be totally flat. It can be a saturation plugin that you have set to be somewhat mild, and you can fine tune it from there. But that's a really nice feature. I've been waiting for that for a while, so that when I insert certain plugins, they don't have some crazy setting that's way too much or a bunch of stuff turned on that I don't need. So you can find your favorite plugins, get your preferred starting point, and go from there. Now you can, of course, still load plugin chain presets. That's totally different. This is just for within the plugin itself. So you can, again, go to the menu, save as default preset. Then anytime that you open up a particular plugin, it's just how you like it. So I think that covers that particular feature. Let's see what else we want to move on to. Let's move on to, well, I mentioned multi-track and multi-channel file support. Again, Ian Stewart has done a great video. It's on YouTube. If you just search YouTube for Ian's latest WaveLab 11 videos, he goes into a little more detail on that. I just do not use, I only work in stereo, so I'm just want to show you what I know here. But there is better support for multi-track file editing, processing. You can even edit, just single channels of the multi-channel file. You can send single channels to an external editor, all sorts of great stuff like that. But let's talk about some of the new plugins that are in WaveLab 11 from Steinberg themselves. On a similar note, Quadrafuzz is a saturator plugin. And again, you want to be real careful using this in mastering because it's adding distortion. But what's cool about it is it's a multi-band, so you have 4 areas. You can saturate the lows, the low mids, the upper mids, and the highs, all a little bit differently, and you can blend it to taste. You can solo just this band to really dial in the saturation and the drive. You can mix it to taste, so you can, with these saturation plugins in mastering, it's usually a pretty low blend. You're not going very high. And then the entire plugin itself you can blend. So this is just a really cool plugin for anywhere from really subtle saturation for mastering, to heavy duty saturation if you're doing sound design or stem mastering, anything like that where you want to go more heavy handed. So Quadrafuzz, cool plugin from Steinberg. I'll try to go logically here. Squasher, it's a multi-band, dynamics processor. I haven't had a chance to spend much time with this one. This is something that seems really useful, again, for stem mastering where you're being a little more heavy-handed or trying to fix a major problem. You got 3 bands here, all sorts of different options to expand or compress. Really flexible plugin called Squasher. De-reverb, probably useful for those editing podcasts, doing sound design, things like that. And the name is pretty self-explanatory. You can control how much reverb or ambience you're going to remove. Perhaps it's somebody speaking in an echoey room, so you can monitor the input. You can monitor just the reverb and hear what this plugin is considering reverb, so you can kind of fine-tune some of the settings, the algorithms, and things like that. And then, of course, monitor the output. And of course, it is multi-band, so you can kind of get into the low mids, which tend to be a little more boomy, and the upper mids could be a little more piercing. So you can do a lot of great stuff with de-reverb, especially for those podcast editors. Let's go next to Imager. It's a great plugin for stereo imaging. Again, in mastering, used, fairly light. You don't want to go overboard with this in mastering usually, but it's a multi-band imager, so you can increase the width of the upper mids more than, say, the low mids or the lows. Or if your lows, there's a lot of talk about monoing the low end for various reasons, whether it's for vinyl or club music, things like that. So you can even, mono the low end a little bit if you need to. So great plugin, great imaging plugin. Let's go next to Frequency 2. Frequency has been updated to be dynamic. So this can be a regular EQ or a dynamic EQ. So it's a really powerful EQ. A lot of great features. And again, you can just switch it into dynamic mode. And instead of being a regular EQ, it's a dynamic EQ. So it's only engaging when certain frequencies, reach a certain level. It's good for controlling something with some boomy bass notes or some sharp sibilants, or anything that's just kind of popping out abnormally. What else do we have here? I'll save supervision for last, but WaveLab comes with a new dither plugin called Lin Dither, and it replaces the Isotope M-Bit Dither Plus and the UV Dither that has been in previous versions, and it's also designed so that it should be able to replace, if you open an old session that has one of those dithers, it is able to at least see the bit depth that you were using in some of the other settings and kind of transparently replace that. But this is a whole new dither. It's very high quality. It's powered by a company called Mott. You may be familiar with some of their other plugins. But so this is a great new addition to WaveLab 11 for dithering. It has auto blanking, which is a feature that I like in a dither plugin, which means when it detects digital silence, it turns the dither noise off. So, if you have a long string of silence between songs or silence for any other reason, the dithering noise itself actually gets turned off. It's intelligent. And then the last plugin I want to show you is called Supervision. And for those that use Cubase, you're probably familiar with this already. But now it's available as a plugin in WaveLab. And this plugin, I would probably use it in the playback processing slots. So we'll go to Supervision, and it has 27 different options for metering, whether it's loudness, VU, spectral information for frequency response, phase scope. I'm going to try to show you the multi-panorama because that's one of my favorites. Oscilloscope, all sorts of stuff, and just basic time code. And you can customize this to look however you like. So let's say you want a level meter, and you can press this button over here and split it horizontally. And again, I like this multi-panorama. And the reason I like it is because from left to right, it's showing you the panning of frequencies. So you can see on the left here, you can see the low end does have some stereo information. The low mids in this area has a lot of stereo information. And as we go higher up the spectrum, it's less wide. And this is just the characteristics of this particular song. It doesn't mean anything, but it's nice to get a visualization of the panning of whatever it is you're working on. And again, this is from left to right. So it's called multi-panorama. I've only seen this in one other plugin that I like to use as a meter, but now it's great that I have this built right in WaveLab. And again, you can split vertically or horizontally to just customize whatever you'd like. So we can add a phase scope. We can add some time code. Again, the possibilities are endless. It's whatever you'd like to have. And the cool thing is when you figure out what you like, you can either save it as a preset. You can also go to default, save as default preset. So if I were to remove that plugin for whatever reason and reload it, it comes back with the exact settings that I left it off as. Now, one advantage to the master section is when you open and close projects, when you open and close WaveLab with the right settings, you don't even have to reload these plugins. So these are, with my settings, these are always there, and I just keep the master section hidden, and I don't even have to think about it. You could put this on another screen. This is all very resizable too. Whatever your preference is, you can resize it to fit an external monitor. All sorts of stuff that you could do with this. So I think that's a very cool addition to WaveLab 11. Just WaveLab already had some of the best metering I've ever seen, which is a big reason to use WaveLab. But with supervision available as a plugin, it just takes it up to another level. So those are some of the plugins available, in the new plugins in WaveLab. I think next, I'm going to see if there's any immediate questions. So just give me a moment. So WaveLab 11 does incorporate some of the WaveLab cast features. So if you purchase WaveLab Pro, you're going to get the cast features built right in. I should have covered them. They're in the track section. And basically, they're in categories called clean and enhance. And you can clean up audio with the dehummer. You can denoise, all the basic stuff that you're used to hearing. De-esser, very important one in my book. Enhance. You can add a little reverb or ambience, EQ, and they're all very basic EQs, kind of tailored for voice and podcast editing, and a maximizer. So a lot of the WaveLab cast features are built right in. If you want to know the actual differences between elements and cast, on the website there's a chart that kind of goes over it all. But for those that have WaveLab Pro, now you have all the WaveLab cast features essentially built right in, including publishing to some of the more popular podcast hosts. You can do it directly within WaveLab and choose the format and do some basic episode titling and stuff like that. So just another cool feature, incorporating some of those WaveLab cast features. So I think the next thing I want to talk about are lanes and groups. So previously, when I would master an album, in fact, here is an actual album I mastered, I would stagger. Now you can ignore the reference track down here, the gray one. I would stagger the tracks. I guess I did this in 11. So basically I would stagger the tracks. I would stagger the songs on 2 separate tracks in WaveLab 10, meaning track 1 would have a song, track 2 would have the next song. The third song will be back on track 1. In WaveLab 11, we can do all of this on one track because tracks now have lanes. And if you click in the header, you can add a stereo track. And then in here, you can add a lane. And you can add up to 8 lanes per track. So this is useful for stem mastering, of course, but also I've been using it just for normal album mastering. Now, instead of having to use more than one track, I just use one track and I just use lanes. And you can, of course, mute lanes or solo lanes. And the cool thing about lanes is you can still do all your clip effects. Lanes give you the option to do take management and things like that. And the other cool thing about lanes is then you still have, in the inspector, you have your clip effects, then you have your track effects, and then you still have your montage output effects. So it just opens up a lot of possibilities here. For example, let's say you master an album and you want the whole thing to be a little bit brighter, just a little bit globally. Instead of having to go song by song, which maybe is a good idea in some cases, but if it's just everything needs to be brighter, you could insert a plugin on the track now that there's only one track, and then you still have your montage output effects, which means if you go to make a vinyl master later and you change these output effects to tailor it for vinyl, you still have your global brightness change that you don't have to worry about. Another thing about lanes that I like, kind of on a similar note, would be, I'm sure this has all happened to most of you. Let's say you're mastering an album or an EP. I'll make it an EP for the sake of time here. Mastering an EP. And here's what it looks like when you're going to insert the files. You now see the option of lanes. So it used to not have this option. It used to just be tracks. So now you can decide if you want to put these clips on lanes or tracks. So I choose lanes. I still like to stagger. And now, as you see, we just have one track and 2 lanes. So let's say you're mastering an EP, but the client has a previous song that's already been mastered by someone else, and they can't get an unmastered copy, and it's kind of a worst case scenario. Well, now what you can do with that previously mastered song is you can put that on its own track. Let me find a rough example of that. Let's say this one is already mastered and that's the way it has to be. You can still put that unmastered, you can put that previously mastered song on its own track. And what that means is I can still do my clip effects per song like I would normally do. The track effects area now becomes kind of your master for the album, because the songs that you're actually going to master today would be on this track. And then the oddball song that's already been mastered is on its own track. And that means, sometimes it's doing absolutely nothing to it. Sometimes it's doing a little tweak to make it fit with the album you're mastering. But what that means is that this one down here is not going to travel through, the limiter that you chose for the whole album that might be on this track. So lanes kind of open up a way of dealing with something like that. When you're trying to master an EP or an album and one song has already been mastered by someone else and you can't get the unmastered version. The other thing that is kind of related to lanes is track groups. And track groups are basically a way to do some basic busing within WaveLab, which has never really been possible before. And it just so happens that somebody sent me some stems to master. I actually didn't master them because I don't like to master from stems, but they included some stems with their stereo mixes for whatever reason. So I'm going to open those stems and show you about track grouping. So these are all the stems for a single I was going to master. I did master it. So I'm going to choose all the stems. I'm going to choose, in this case, I'm going to choose tracks. Lanes are useful for stem mastering. You're limited to 8, and I'll explain a little bit of that. But let's say you're just going to master a single song, do stem mastering. I'm going to put them all on a separate track here. Let me redo that. I want to put them in a slightly more logical order. So I'll do drums, bass, acoustic guitar, regular guitar, piano, pedal steel, banjo, vocals, backing. So this is a more logical order for me. And I'm going to insert them. And they're kind of quiet, so I'll blow up the waveforms. But now you can see all the stems. And what you can do with track groups in WaveLab is you can select, I could select the drums and bass. Let's say I was stem mastering this, and I wanted to kind of glue the drums and bass together, which would mean add a compressor that is compressing the drums and bass together, both of them at the same time. I could select the 2 tracks and choose trying to choose group tracks. Not something I've done a whole lot of yet, so bear with me. There it is right in front of me. Add selected tracks to groups. So that pops up, and I could call this, call this the rhythm group. And you can color code things. You can color code the clips. And now we have a group here. And if you go back to the inspector, you'll notice the group effects area is now available. It wasn't available before because I hadn't grouped any tracks. And now I can insert a plugin on this track, the group for the track. So anything that I routed to this group, which for now is just the drums and bass, they're now going through this. The drums and bass are both going through this plugin. So that's kind of nice. It's kind of like internal routing, internal busing for WaveLab. And again, probably more useful for stem mastering, but I'm sure people can come up with some other creative uses for track grouping. Again, it's pretty new to me, as you saw. I haven't really used it in a real life scenario yet because I really don't do stem mastering, but the options are there. If you right click, you can edit the track groups, so you can see which tracks are in the group, which tracks are not in the group. You could add another group, all sorts of things like that. So that is track grouping. So let's kind of start fresh with automation because that's probably where things went wrong. I'll just start by removing the plugin. I'll insert this plugin. And as I mentioned, the volume envelope is always going to be there. And the pan, which used to be in this envelope section, has now been moved to this area as well. So if you want to pan, it's as simple as that. So the pan has just been moved. And then, as you can see, you can right-click in here and see all the possible parameters that you can automate. But that can be a lot to look at because a lot of plugins have so many buttons. So what you can do is right-click on a button, and it's just going to create an envelope for that button or knob. So I'm going to choose to automate the gain of band 2. I'm just going to click right in here. And as I play this, you'll notice right in here that the gain is increasing slowly just as the envelope has been told to do. Sorry about the hiccup about the screen. And yeah, so automation is very simple. And as I was explaining, there's different ways to change the envelope now in WaveLab. If you just highlight an area on a clip and click, it's going to create a very sharp change, not very smooth, very sharp. If you hold Command, it's going to create 4 nodes where it kind of does a ramp up into that. And this is true for volume, panning, any kind of thing that any volume, any envelope, it's going to do that. If you hold Option and Command, and this is on Mac, of course, it creates a slightly different shape. And then you can also just double click and it creates an end on each side and then the initial node to do some automation. So that's how you basically get automation going in WaveLab. Again, it's available on clips in the montage. You can use this little eyeball to see which envelope you're seeing. There is an option, it seems to be on by default, to only show one envelope. You can see them all at one time, but as you can see, it could get a little messy to see them all at one time. So it's kind of your choice if you prefer just to see one and choose which one you're seeing, or if you want to see them all, that's fine. You can turn them off too. So if you are unsure if the automation is helping or hurting, instead of having to delete it or do something strange, you can just simply turn the automation envelope on or off, which is kind of cool. There is some smoothing. So as you see, when I press the smoothing button, instead of being so direct, it's actually, smooths out those curves. Some people may want that. Some people may not. I think that's about everything I want to cover for automation. You can reset the envelope. One interesting thing that's kind of been blocked here because of my view is you can also manually type things in. So let's go to the volume. It's basically going to show you some details about it. So right now, it's telling me that the fade is happening at 225 and 666 milliseconds. If the fade was supposed to start at 230, I could manually type in 230, and the fade is going to change to that. And there's all sorts of different, well, there's 3 different options. There's relative to the start of the montage, relative to the start of clip, and end of clip. So as you change this value is going to have a different meaning. But basically, if you are someone that likes to just type things in, then you can just type in some parameters instead of, and I think I may have requested this, but I think you can also copy and paste some of this text for if you're doing an instrumental version. And of course, you can always copy the entire envelope in this area if you need to copy this envelope to an instrumental or TV mix, things like that. But just another nice new little feature of WaveLab 11 with, aside from the automation, the ability to manually type in exactly where you want things to happen and how loud you want them to be and things like that. So let's move on to another topic. Unless anyone has any automation questions, I'll just take a moment to read through the comments. Okay, so let's move on to another topic here. One of my favorite new features of a WaveLab 11 is maybe not very exciting to most people, but it kind of ties into reference tracks. And I still notice that a lot of people are, not a lot, but some people are using WaveLab 9.5 still. And one of my favorite new features of 10 was reference tracks. So my next thing I'm going to show you is tied into reference tracks. Now there's two reasons to use a reference track. One would be to hear, well, there's 3 actually. Reference tracks are how I send the unmastered audio out to the analog chain, which I'm not going to really show today, but reference tracks allow you to route to different hardware outputs all at the same time. Very handy. But when we're working in the box, reference tracks are useful for hearing, a rough mastered version that the mix engineer did, or just hearing the raw unmastered mix itself and comparing it to what you're working on. And the cool thing is that reference tracks do not go through any of your master processing, so they skip all of that. It's very handy. So let's say I'm mastering a single, and I'm doing my thing, and I'm trying to decide if I'm making it better or how's it comparing to what it started like. And what you can do is make a reference track. So you can add a reference track from the menu. There's a shortcut, but I like to use menus in these videos because then you can really see where it is. And you could somewhat do this in WaveLab 10, but now when you right click, you can copy clips to the reference track and you get a nice new menu. And the menu is, of course, all clips, selected clips. But the cool thing is, and I have these off on purpose, you can copy it to the reference track without any changes that you made. So now you're hearing the totally untouched file when you press this ear or solo button. It used to be that if you copied a clip to a reference track, it would take all the plugins, all the gain envelope, everything about it would be copied down, which wasn't ideal. So now you can copy it down without any effects. I'll show you that menu again. You can copy it without any plugins, without any volume and pan envelopes, and without any of the clip gain. So it's a really quick way to get the truly unmastered version down to the reference track, and then you can compare again what it sounded like with what you're doing, and it's a great way. The other thing that I'll just quickly talk about reference tracks is this album I mastered the other day. As you can see, it's kind of long, 17 songs. It's a bit of a concept album and had very precise song transitions. And what the client did is this bottom reference track, they sent me a single MP3 of the entire album, how they wanted it to flow, just a single file. And then I was able to match up both visually, and as you can see, some things got edited after they heard it, so it's not in sync anymore, but maybe if we go to the earlier stuff, you'll see. So you can match up visually exactly how they want it, and then you can, of course, hear the transitions by soloing to hear how they might have done any fading, crossfades and things like that. So reference tracks are really handy for sequencing albums that have very specific crossfades, transitions that need to happen. So I just wanted to do a quick recap on reference tracks because, again, I think some people are still on 9.5. Some people haven't really explored reference tracks too much, even in 10. So I just wanted to go over that. Let's see. I'm just checking my list here of things to cover. We've covered the multi-core processing and more plugin slots. The last thing I really want to tell you about, again, if Ian Stewart has some great videos on YouTube that go into especially the multi-channel stuff. The last thing really just pertains to metadata, and in particular my settings, my metadata settings. I've changed it because WaveLab, how do I want to say this? I basically changed it so that the metadata of a rendered file is going to come from the marker name, and the file name is going to come from the CD text. That's different than how it used to be. So if you're using my metadata settings and you're using WaveLab 11, you may want to go to the WaveLab help website and download the new metadata setting, only if you care about this, but I care about this. So what would happen was, if you're mastering an album that has special characters in the title, obviously those usually can't be in CD text, and they're a bad idea to put in the file name because downstream Windows users or even some digital distributors might have a problem with that. So I've updated it so that when you're entering in the project information, the marker names should now have any special characters, and the CD text, which is a different window, is what you want to keep clean. And I always keep this restrict to ASCII setting on so that my CD text is always valid and things like that. So basically, when the markers you can have a bunch of special characters, that's going to get pushed to the metadata of the WAV or MP3. The CD text, which you should probably be keeping more simplified anyway with the ASCII restriction, that is what's going to be the file name. And the cool thing is, so CD text can contain question marks and a couple basic special characters. Windows does not allow question marks in file names. So by doing this, there is a setting that you may want to be aware of. And global formats. In this section, there's a create Windows compatible file names. I like to keep that on because I've had cases, I learned this the hard way. I had a zip file of masters, and one song had a question mark in the file name, and the Windows user kept saying when they unzipped it, the file wasn't there. Well, it's because Windows doesn't allow question marks in file names for the most part. So that setting will keep your actual rendered file name safe, which means your clients who are Windows users won't have an issue. A digital distributor or some sort of downstream software won't have an issue with the file name. So right now, I'm reading a question here. How do you match between reference track and the one you work on? I honestly do it by ear. There's the meta normalizer, which helps. The master section has something called smart bypass, which will compensate the level. I do hope that in the future it will be added that smart bypass is in the montage itself. But, honestly, it's not something that slows me down. There are plugins. Ian Shepard's Perception AB plugin is good for that. There's a number of ways to do it. There's not an automatic way right now, but the reference track is something maybe you don't always want to level match it. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. I use the reference track a lot just for sequencing purposes, so the level is irrelevant, but I'm hoping that does get added in the future where smart bypass is right within the montage itself. So yeah, that's basically my favorite things of WaveLab 11. If anybody has any questions about WaveLab 11 or in particular, I didn't do a live stream last month because even something as simple as metadata, as I just mentioned, I knew was going to change, so I skipped last month. But coming up, I'm going to do a deep dive on metadata and retouch on some stuff with lanes. Some kind of a deeper dive into all the new stuff. But if anyone has any questions for now, let me know. Otherwise, as you know, wavelabhelp.com has a bunch of resources for some of my settings. There's a WaveLab users Facebook group where you can ask questions and myself or others can help you. There's the WaveLab forum. It's a great place to ask questions, report any issues, things like that. And for those that join late, if you're looking for a demo of WaveLab 11, it'll be available in a few weeks. Traditionally, Steinberg waits a couple weeks to offer trials of new software. But you can always upgrade today. I think it's a no-brainer upgrade if you use WaveLab daily just because of the performance. There's a lot of little things that are nice about WaveLab 11. So if you use it daily, I think it's worth upgrading. I've been using it for a while now, and I have no issues, no crashes, no bugs with my workflow. So I think it's a good time to jump in. So I guess I'm going to leave it at that if there's no other questions. And I apologize for the disruption when the screen was lost. I was pressing a shortcut in WaveLab and somehow it triggered it in the streaming software, and that's what happened there. So thanks for tuning in, and watch for another live stream next month on a specific topic. Okay, someone said, can you answer my question? So I can answer it. I'll wait for it to show up. We're probably on about a 30-second delay, so let me see. Essentially, yes, I keep the same workflow for capturing, I kind of hinted at this with reference tracks, but let me see if this template works. Yeah, so I use reference tracks to get the audio out of WaveLab. Now, I don't have my normal interface chosen because of this live stream, but if I did, it might look like this. And let me see. So basically, I'm playing the audio out of a reference track. And what I was trying to show you is that reference tracks can have more than one, they can feed more than one output. So it's still set to mutex for some reason. I may not have, I clearly don't have this. Here we go. So here's the reference, here's where I would start. Track 1 is where I'm going to record back to. Track 2 is where I would put the audio files, the unmastered files, which I guess I could find right here. Original files. Let's see. I'll just grab a couple. Could put them on a track. So now these files are going out to, they're not selected because I changed interfaces, but these are all going to all three of my converters at the same time, and even a raw output, which I technically do on this track, so there's no clip effects being applied. But yeah, playing it out of a reference track to all my DA converters, choosing the converter I want to feed the gear, then recording it back to a regular montage track, and then I can trim up. I personally don't like to capture the limiting. I like to have the limiting playing, auditioning the limiting, but not being committed to that, because then you're painted into a corner for revisions, for vinyl master, anything like that. I always capture without limiting and then do any heads and tails, sequencing, fine tuning. Then I render the final versions, after the capture. Just opens up a bigger workflow. I'm not sure what you mean by universal key commands, but in WaveLab you can program the shortcuts however you'd like. There's a lot of pre-programmed ones. There's a lot that I've already edited, but you can search for something simple as insert audio files. And you can see what I've programmed, but you can always reprogram it to whatever you'd like. So you can really customize WaveLab and the key commands. And then, of course, these are something you can save and back up. So in my preferences, that's all my key commands. And that's something I would back up to Dropbox so that if I could transfer them to my other computers. I have a backup if my computer would crash, if I get a new computer. All the preferences, like I talked about in the beginning, are in this folder, open setting folder. So back those up. You can customize key commands, whatever you'd like. Does Supervision supersede ClarityM? They're really just two different, they're apples and oranges. The reason I have ClarityM is because other programs I use don't have such good metering as WaveLab, and I figure as long as I might as well have it running over on the side of my desk. The advantage to ClarityM is that it's not taking up screen space. So, Supervision has a lot more features than ClarityM. You could put it on a separate screen, but they're all, LUFS is LUFS. Frequency response is basically frequency response. There's no better or worse there. But Supervision is a great new addition to WaveLab 11. If I had to choose one or the other, I'd obviously choose Supervision because there's a whole lot more. But since I have the ClarityM here, may as well use it. Well, showing the analog capture process, that's going to be a whole separate video, but I kind of explained the basics of it. Is the key is using a reference track to send the audio out instead of a normal track, because again, you can get all these options of which output path they're going to send it to, and as you can see, it's simultaneous. So I have 3 that I like, and then if I was really doing a session, what I would do is select these and copy them to the 3rd reference track. I would set this one to raw output so that I can solo on my monitor controller a completely untouched version, because eventually these are going to get a plug-in chain. And they're going through the analog gear and back in. So I want to be able to hear a completely untouched version on my monitor controller. So that's why I separate it out. I could send this track to the raw output, which it was. That's how it would be. But if I toggle to that on the monitor controller, then I'm hearing any clip effects that I might be adding. So it's not the true unmastered version. It's close, but not true. So I just like to, that's why I have 2 reference tracks here. It's just these feed the converters, because there will be some clip effects on each song, specific to each song, before it goes analog. And then the 2nd reference track is just absolutely clean, straight to the monitor controller digitally. So I'll do a whole nother analog chain video with WaveLab 11. Not a whole lot has changed, though, to be honest, aside from performance. The routing is basically the same, although now that we have track grouping, you could, in theory, you could pre-mix a bunch of stems easily on one single track using lanes and then send that entire track out to the analog gear. Because with analog gear, you're usually doing stereo processing, because who has 8 channels of expensive mastering gear? So the lanes thing really helps you kind of sum all your stems to a single track output, and then you can master it just as if you were starting from stereo, but you still have the independence of adjusting each stem, each clip effects. So anyways, I'm going to wrap it up there, but thanks again for tuning in. Check out wavelabhelp.com, WaveLab Facebook group, and the Steinberg forum for any additional help. And of course, visit the Steinberg website if you want to check out Ian's videos, see about pricing, and some other in-depth information about the new features. And have a great day.